Welcome back, everyone. I'm Sathy, and today's guest has spent about 20 years at the intersection of data, AI, and pharmaceutical industry. First in big data, and now advising the leaders of large organizations on what it actually takes to make AI work at enterprise scale. He's a consultant, a fellow podcaster, and someone who thinks about AI for large pharma. Thibault, really great to have you.
Sathy, thanks for having me in your show.
Great. So, Thibault, before we get into the big topics, tell us a bit about yourself. 20 years in pharma and data is a long time. So, how did you end up where you are today?
It's a good question because it was not planned. So I'm a scientist by training. I studied structural biology, so it's kind of a discipline at the intersection of biology and physics. While I was finishing my PhD, I was trying to figure out, okay, what can I do, outside of academia, because that's not something I really thought a lot about. And I almost became a product manager by accident. So there was a particular brand that I was using when I was in the lab. So they were providing laboratory equipment and tools, and I liked them. I met them at a conference, and I thought, well, why not working with them? So that's kind of how I got my first job outside of academia. I became a product manager for a German company called QIAGEN. They produce all sorts of equipment, agent, instruments that are used in the lab. They really revolutionized many parts of the scientific workflow in the lab. So things that used to take several days, they invented tools that can turn several days into just a few minutes. So they really made a big impact in how people do science, and I really wanted to work with them. I worked with them for a few years, multiple product line, started to learn, what's life outside of academia, so a mix of science and business. And after that, actually after 5 years, I was contacted by a recruiter who asked me if I wanted to work for Elsevier. So Elsevier is the largest scientific publisher. And my first reaction was, no, I don't want to work for a publisher, because I think us as scientists, we have this love-hate relationship with publishing, because you have to publish to disseminate scientific information. Essentially, the recruiter told me, well, it's working for a large publisher, but it's not in the publishing department. It's actually in their life science data and analytics team. So that was really how I got into data, because this team was actually extracting data from unstructured source, so from published paper, from all sort of scientific paper, patents, and all sort of sources where you have scientific data, and they were taking the data and creating search engines for scientists. So search engine designed for chemists, for biologists, for people working in pharmacology, etc., etc. And that's how I got started in the field of data. So initially in a marketing role, where I was in charge of marketing those data products. And then after a few years, I moved to be a product manager, to lead a large product manager organization where we were building those products. And as you mentioned in the introduction, at that time we were talking about big data. So it was really the thing in the industry was you heard people say pharmaceutical companies and a lot of companies outside of pharmaceutical industry are sitting on large amount of data and are not necessarily doing anything about them or with them. So what if we could leverage all this data to make incredible discovery? So a lot of the things that we were doing in this role were really to organize data and create tools so that people could actually ask questions. It was really at the time search engines, and the way it evolved over the years, it went from search engine to creating predictive tools. So using the data to make prediction, not just searching. I was there also at the time when LLM started. Actually, we started to use LLMs, or not LLMs, but to use some of the tools that were developed by Google way before ChatGPT was launched. And at that time, I remember our data science team coming to me and say, hey, we are using Google BERT and we do all sorts of very interesting things. And I will fully admit that, a couple of years before the launch of ChatGPT, I was like, well, explain to me why should I care? So I really didn't get it. And then when ChatGPT was launched, I was like, okay, so now I understand why my data science team was telling me that this thing, the transformer, were so revolutionary. And in many ways, I think this was a wake-up call that sometime, a simple tweak, putting a simple interface on top of of an interesting technology can make the whole difference. But that's kind of how I got almost by accident into the world of data.
Wow, fantastic. And that's a nice story. So, and you've been working with leaders inside large pharma companies on AI adoption. So, what are the three biggest challenges that you've seen on ground, not in theory, but what actually gets in the way?
I think there are many things. So I don't know if I can summarize them just to three, but I'll do my best. When you're dealing with scientists, by definition, scientists are very skeptical. So the more hype there is around something, the more resistance it creates. And what we can see in the history of biological science, and specifically in pharma, you have waves of technology. So it's interesting because sometimes we say that pharmaceutical industry is slow at adopting technology. I don't think that's true. Actually, pharma industry is very quick at adopting technology, but it doesn't necessarily do it in the right way. So then there is a bit of a clash between expectation and the reality. In the past, we had all sorts of technology where there was a lot of hype saying, adopting this technology will really transform how we discover new drugs. And then it turned out not to be the reality. So before I answer your question, I think it might be worth, for your listener to step back a little bit just so that they understand the scale of the problem of what we do in pharma. So the role of the pharmaceutical industry is to develop drugs. So there are approximately 24,000 known diseases, and we have approximately 3,000 or 4,000 drugs that are marketed in the world. And those 3,000 or 4,000 drugs, they are not against 3,000 or 4,000 diseases, because we have a number of drugs that are targeting the same disease. So you might have 3,000 or 4,000 drugs against 1,000 diseases. So it means that there are approximately, 24 minus 1,000, 23,000 diseases that don't really have a good drug. The process of developing a drug and getting the drug approved by the pharmaceutical authority takes a very long time. In general, we say it takes 10 to 12 years, but this is without taking into consideration the time that people in academia spent working on the disease and understanding the disease. So if you take something like the famous GLP-1 inhibitor, so the thing that are in the Ozempic drugs, the drugs that are commercialized nowadays by Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly against diabetes and obesity, I think there was something like 20 or 30 years of work in academia before that went to the pharmaceutical industry, where it took another 10 years to develop the drug. So every year, if you look at the large regulators in the world, whether it's European Medicine Agency or the FDA in the US, the FDA in the US in a very good year will approve something like 50 drugs. So if you look at how many drugs we are developing every year, the time it takes 10 to 12 years plus the time in academia, the cost anywhere between 2 to 6 billion. It will take, if we continue to develop the drugs the way we do to address all the diseases, it will take us another 500 years. Now, going back to the story on technology, the idea is that if we get better technology in pharma, we'll be able to do a better job. We'll be able to accelerate the timelines. So we had waves of technology. So for instance, if I look in the 80s, there was something called combinatorial chemistry. So when you develop drugs, you have different type of drugs, but let's say the drugs that are developed by chemists, so they need to synthesize small molecules and then test them. And when combinatorial chemistry was invented, one chemist could synthesize 800 times more molecules per year, because that was really a step change in what they could do. And now I'm sure you heard about genome sequencing, fast forward in the year 2000. The first genome sequence that we produced, I think the cost was something like 3 billion, and over 10 years or 10 or 15 years, now you can sequence a genome for a few $100s, and it will take a day or less. So again, we have those incredible
$200.
Yeah, I think
It's
it's decreasing every day, to be honest. So I think the latest I've seen was a company that was offering that for $100. So it's nothing. And then we thought, okay, if it's so cheap, everyone can have their genome sequence, and then we will know all the potential diseases that you will be able to get. Of course, it's not that simple, and that didn't materialize into an explosion of new drugs. So going back to your question, I know it's a long, winded answer, but when it comes to I think it's people, especially people who've been in a long time in this industry, they have a similar reaction. They're like, oh, okay, we have this tool now, and so many people are saying it will solve all our problems. I've been through that. I've been through a number of technological waves. So why is this one different? And I think that's how a number of scientists who have been in this business for a long time are reacting and thinking, okay, I'm very skeptical. But then this skepticism turns into a couple of things. It can turn into I'm skeptical and resistant. I just don't believe it because the more hype around something, the least I want to even try it. I mean, I meet a lot of people in the industry who don't even want to try the tools. And then there are people who are actually quite enthusiastic because they see the potential. So I think that's one of the main challenge with AI adoption in our industry is the very nature of people using the tool. And for our discussion, I will focus mostly on the earlier stage of pharma because pharma, it's actually many different jobs. So you have the research, then you have a clinical phase, and then you have the commercial phase. My background is more on the research side, so the discovery of the early stages of R&D. And we can talk a bit about the rest, but my expertise is more in the earlier stages. So yeah, when you deal with scientists, there is a high dose of skepticism, which means that adoption can be a challenge. And the fact also that those tools are evolving at a pace that we've never seen before. So there are things that were science fiction a few months ago, and now you can ask questions, you can predict things that you couldn't do before. And unless you're spending a lot of time monitoring what happens with AI, or sometimes you can just you're just not up to date with the tools that are available because there are no tools in the history of technology that evolve so fast. So some scientists may have had a look at the AI tools a few months ago and then realize, well, what they need is not really there. And then now it might be available, but they don't know about it. And I think last but not least, last time I looked, I think there were something like 300 or 400 companies that were creating tools, AI tools targeting the pharmaceutical industry. And when you look at how they position themselves online, they all say the same. They say something like, we are using AI and technology to revolutionize drug discovery and development. So they are all offering, certain tools, certain models, and that they combine in a more or less clever way, and then they commercialize that to scientists in the pharmaceutical industry. And I'm doing quite a lot of work with startup. I'm advising quite a lot of CEOs and founders. And very often the discussion I have with them is the way you're positioning your tool is the same as 100 other companies. When you go to a trade show, an exhibition, and you walk to the booth of some of those small companies, they all say the same. So it's incredibly difficult for scientists and for leaders in the pharmaceutical industry to actually know which company they should even try. I mean, I'm not even saying trust, but just try things. There is so much out there and so little differentiation in the way companies talk about themselves that it's incredibly difficult to know which one is actually the relevant one. And I'll finish with this thought. At the moment, the way sometimes I'm talking about it, it's a bit like when we talk about evolution of species, we talk about Cambrian. So the Cambrian is this phase in the evolution of species where you had animals that had all sorts of shapes. Some looked completely crazy. They had too many eyes, too many legs, too many things that we don't see nowadays. And when you're thinking about this phase, you're like, how could nature create those things? But then eventually, some of those things turned into the animals and turned into the humans that we are today. And I think we are living a similar phase when you can make a parallel with what we see now with AI and companies and models. We have all sorts of crazy things. And, 5 years from now, we'll look back at this time and we'll like, why did someone even create this thing or this company or this model? I mean, it had no reason to exist. But I think, there is this enthusiasm and everyone wants a piece of the cake. So everyone is trying something. But eventually, some of the new Google, some of the new Microsoft, some of the new, whatever big company will emerge from this era where people are trying everything.
Yeah, absolutely. No doubt, right? And it does get really interesting to see the progress in industry. While talking about that, you told me about this story about a chief data scientist and an AI officer, I think, at a pharma industry, and they received an offer from Claude, but then it took them 4 months just to evaluate the product.
Yeah.
And in that 4 months, I think the landscape had changed completely. Would you like to repeat that for us?
Yeah. So I think I'm talking about one, but I could talk about a number actually. The way, as I said, the way we do things in the pharmaceutical industry, it's quite a conservative industry. It's a regulated industry. It's not like in tech where you can just make things, break them, and and see what happens. Here we are dealing with patients. Eventually everything we do, the goal is to treat someone. So there are guardrails, there are ways of doing things. So when we evaluate products, when we evaluate technology, when we evaluate anything in the pharmaceutical industry, there is a process. And this process doesn't work well with a tool that we have now and with the pace at which the tools are evolving. So especially when you're dealing with a purchasing process. So the story I was telling you is that every company at the moment, they know they need to use AI and they are evaluating tools. Yeah, one that I was talking with was telling me that they received this offer for, I think it was for Claude, and it took them 4 months to evaluate. Okay, is this a reputable company? Can we trust them? So that's the type of question that we will ask. And from a purchaser standpoint, I mean, some of those companies have very interesting ways of doing business that is not really aligned with the traditional way pharmaceutical company are proceeding. So they could ask a question like, no, how stable are your releases? Will we be aware when you're changing something? So of course, like those things now, like any modern software company will ship several versions of their tools, every day. Which, like I wouldn't be surprised if someone asked in a pharma company, well, we need something stable. I mean, you can't change it. If you buy something and we evaluate it, we need to have it stable for a certain amount of time, and you will need to tell us before you do any modification. So you see, I mean, there is this clash of culture. So here I'm kind of, I'm inventing a bit, but I wouldn't be surprised if these kind of discussions are happening.
Yeah. 100%, right? Yeah, I think that's really interesting, especially with Claude, when it is becoming
Yeah.
so difficult to keep up with their updates every day.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, I haven't seen that with Claude too much, but sometimes with ChatGPT, sometimes there are things that I really like, and then the next day it doesn't behave the same, and I don't like it anymore. Lately, for the past few weeks, actually, I don't really like the way it writes. So I recorded things that I wanted it to have in the memory in terms of style, in terms of language, in terms of the way the text should be formatted. And for a long time, it was working perfectly. I really liked it. And lately, it's just not doing what I want, and I'm spending a lot of time giving again instructions. So that's exactly my point. I mean, this is not a big deal when you use it, to rewrite an email or to write a piece of. But if you use that in the context of a much more sensitive application where you need stability, then that becomes a big.
Yeah. That poses some very big risk. Yeah. Now, talking about that, let's get into science, right? You talked about how you'd like to share your screen and show us how AI is actually being used inside pharma to accelerate drug development.
Yeah, let me share with you part of the process. So the process I want to talk about is what we call the lab in the loop. So the way the scientific process was done, for many years was a very linear process. So you will have a question, design an experiment. So you go and look for scientific information. You design your experiment. You run your experiment. You get the data. And then once you get the data, then either you say, okay, my initial idea is confirmed, or my initial idea was wrong, and then you get to the next point. So it was a very linear process, and then very often the data that you generated, well, you keep them somewhere because you need to, but it's very much like single-use data. And now this thing is really changing in the pharmaceutical industry. So how is this changing? So you still start with an idea, but then instead of directly going into designing an experiment and running this experiment, then you will test this idea in silico. Why would you do that? So if you look at the design, for instance, of small molecules, like small chemical molecules that will potentially be a drug, there are something like 10 to the power of 60 potential molecule. That's what we call the chemical space of molecule with a drug-like property. So 10 to the power of 60. Just to give you a perspective of how big this number is, I think if you were to count every grain of sand that you have in the deserts in the world, everywhere in the world, on all the beaches, it's 10 to the power of 25. And I think the number of atoms in the universe is 10 to the power of 80. So 10 to the power of 60 is a very big number. So obviously there is no way you can synthesize all the molecules that look like a drug. You can't even represent them in a computer because it's too much. But there is a big difference between the number of small molecule with drug-like property that you can synthesize and the number that you can represent in a computer. There are several order of magnitudes. So the way we do this kind of workflow now, instead of going straight to the lab and doing experiment, we'll go to a computer and then we'll simulate. So we'll say, okay, I'm working on a certain biological target. I'm looking for something with this and that property. Can you design the best possible drugs? Can you compute them? So the algorithm will do that. And then what happened is that instead of, it will give you a list, and instead of making several thousands of hundreds of thousands of drugs, like making them, then you will be able to select those that are the more likely to work. So you might be able to do just a few hundreds. Why? Because instead of selecting them randomly, you will be able to say, those are the ones that are predicted to be the best. So you'll synthesize them, and then you'll test them. So you'll test them in the lab, and now we even have robotics lab who can do that automatically instead of doing this manually. Then you generate data, and then those data, you feed them back in the model. So you do that in a sort of a loop, so that the model that generated your, the molecule that you want to test, you tested them, you get a result, and then you feed this result back, and then the model can learn. So that's what we call now the lab in the loop. So essentially, it's a learning loop that you have in pharmaceutical organization. And I gave you an example of a type of learning loop in a chemistry lab, but you can extend that to many parts of the process in the pharmaceutical industry. And I think this model is really one of the modern way we actually do research in pharmaceutical labs. Why do we do that? Because, as I said, we can explore a much bigger experimental space. We reduce the number of things that we actually do in the lab, so it means that we can work faster. We can work also much cheaper. So there are companies now that we call TechBios. So the TechBios essentially are sort of biotechnology company or pharmaceutical companies that were created in the era of technology and AI. If you look at the pharmaceutical industry, it started several hundred years ago. I think the oldest pharmaceutical company in the world is Merck in Germany, which is over 300 years. So you can imagine that during the course of 300 years, you create a lot of complexity. Now you have companies, the TechBio, that were created maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago. So they really started already in the information age. So the way they design their foundation, their technological foundation, their data foundation is very different. And a lot of those companies actually started without a lab. They just started in a computer, just doing simulation, and then they added the lab component afterward. So when you look at companies like that, so one of my favorite is a company called In Silico Medicine. In silico medicine, for instance, they've been able to bring drug candidates to the clinical trial phase in something like 18 months. So the normal time for the first phase in drug discovery and development, what we call the discovery and preclinical phase, is normally 5 to 6 years. So the TechBio have been able to compress those timelines on average in 18 months. So yeah, that's one of the examples I wanted to give.
Fantastic. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah. So in that case, what does this mean for the timeline of drug discovery? So One is, of course, there is AI, which affects the timeline for drug discovery. But what is still irreplaceable by AI in the physical world?
You still need to generate data. So I think we are still not at this phase where, when you watch an episode of Star Trek, they will have this small device, and then they'll put it on you, and then it kind of generates a drug which is customized, personalized for you. We're not there yet. So in science, I mean, not only in the pharmaceutical industry, but in science in general, you make prediction. So you will use AI, you'll use mathematical models to make prediction, but those predictions need to be tested. And the test then will tell you whether your model works or whether your model has gaps. And of course, a model always has gaps. And the more data you generate, the better your model become, and the more predictive it becomes. But we are still at this phase where we need to generate a lot of data to feed those models. Because if you remember what I was saying, is that the way we've been doing science for many, many, many years is we had an idea, we do an experiment, we generate data, and then we answer the question. But then the data that we generated over the last several decades were not data that we generated thinking that one day we will use them to train models. Why? Simply because at that time, no one was thinking that AI will be something that we use in the pharmaceutical industry. Like if you think back to the 80s or the 70s, of course, no one could know. So the data that we generated at that time, and you don't even have to go back several decades. I mean, even if you go back like 5 or 10 years, I've done that, when I was working in a pharma company, opening archives that are 5 or 10 years old. And often, you will find files where, let's say, an Excel file. I mean, everyone loves Excel in the pharma industry. And you open it and you don't have column headers, or you have a bunch of numbers, but you have no idea what it is about. So it means that you can't do anything with those data. So the point I'm trying to make here is that now we know that we need to generate data, and we know that we need to generate AI-ready data. What does it mean, AI-ready data? It's data that are contextualized, like data with a lot of metadata, so that you can use this data to train your model. Another thing which is very important is that when you do an experiment, sometimes it works. What does it mean it works? So sometimes it does the thing that you want to demonstrate. Sometimes it doesn't work. So, the experiment fails. So I'll give you an example. If you have a biological target, for a scientist, an experiment that works is that you will find a drug that can go into this target and that attached to this target, that binds to this target. So that will be a positive result. A negative result will be that you create a small molecule and it doesn't bind. In the past, when we had a negative result, it was something that we didn't like. We're like, oh, okay, we didn't find what we want. But nowadays, with models, we need both. We need the positive and we need the negative. Because you need to train a model to know what good looks like and what bad looks like. And we don't have a lot of negative, because historically we didn't really keep a lot of the negative data. Same thing, as I said, I was working in the publishing industry for many years, and there was this joke almost in the industry that we need to have scientific papers where people can publish their failed experiment, and that will be a lot, because most of the thing you do in the pharmaceutical industry or in science fails. I I have a daughter, she's 10 years old, and when she complained that, she did something and it doesn't work, I'm like, look, my life, literally my profession life, is to work on things that most of the time don't work. In the pharmaceutical industry, things fail 95% of the time. So, we have potentially a lot of negative data, but we were not really good at keeping and organizing those negative data. And now that will be actually a treasure trove of data to train models. So now that we are conscious of all that, there is a lot more effort going on in creating data sets, clean data sets, augmented data set, labeled data set that can be used to train the model, to make the model much more predictive. But this is the type of thing that we've realized. I think we came to realize that only in the past couple of years. And now you even have companies now that created robotic labs, where you can generate very large quantity of data with use of robotic platforms, so that you can do it faster. You can do it also a little bit cheaper.
Got it. Got it. Very interesting. So from that perspective, right? So let's talk about this. What does this mean for people? A lot of jobs have been eliminated in pharma, and what is actually happening from your perspective? What's happening in this space for someone
Yeah,
that's working in this space?
It's a very interesting question. And I think in pharma, it doesn't really have anything to do with AI yet. So if you compare to the tech industry, where Cloud Code or OpenAI Codex, they can really speed up the work of developers. And then, of course, a lot of the thing that you see at the moment is tech companies eliminating jobs, because they say, look, one developer with the right tool can do the job that a 10 developer used to do before. Um, there you get the sense of why companies are eliminating job, because the productivity is increasing. Although I think we could have a lot of conversation whether, is this really what is happening, or is it just a narrative and a way to justify poor investment. And it's better to say, okay, we use AI and we are more efficient, than just saying, okay, we made poor investment and we need to reduce our workforce. But that's an entire different discussion. But I think in the tech industry, there is an argument to be made that AI can already replace jobs. In pharma, I don't think that we are there yet. But you mentioned it, in the pharmaceutical industry, the last 2-3 years have been really, really tough. And I think over 2 or 3 years, over 50,000 jobs were eliminated in the pharmaceutical industry. The reasons are multiple. There is, what happened after COVID. So during COVID, there was a lot of hiring going on, I think, in the pharma industry and also in other industries. And what we've seen after that was a course correction. So there is over hiring, and then people are just letting people go afterward. That's one thing. And the pharmaceutical industry is also one which is extremely sensitive to geopolitical changes. I mean, one of the largest pharmaceutical company in Europe is Novo Nordisk. Novo Nordisk is a Danish company, and what was going on between the US and Denmark. So there was a lot of pressure, and there was a lot of pressure also on pharmaceutical company to invest in the US, to build production plant in the US. And one thing that I think no industry is instability. And instability and uncertainty are things that we really, really don't like in the pharmaceutical industry. So that created a lot of challenges, because we're like, okay, if the future is uncertain, we can't really invest. And, that kind of create a downward spiral where people are being let go. There is also another thing to take into consideration. So in the pharmaceutical industry, we talk a lot about the patent cliff. So what does that mean? When you launch a drug, you have a patent that is protecting you for I don't know exactly how long. I think 10 years or more from the time you registered the patent. So which means that when you have a drug which is a blockbuster, so a drug which could in certain cases generate several billions of revenue per year, for a few years you're really protected. You're the only one who can commercialize this drug. But then when your patent expires, then people can make generic, which means that you will be able to get a similar drugs from another company at a fraction of the cost, which means that some of the drug manufacturers are facing the loss of several billions in revenues. And we have quite a lot of blockbusters now that are coming at the end of their life in terms of patent protection. So when you take all this together, COVID, geopolitical situation, patent cliff, that's one of the main explanations of what happened in the pharma job market. Now AI, of course, plays a role, I think, like everywhere, because pharmaceutical company, they need to invest into AI. If you look at the number one pharmaceutical company in the world in terms of valuation, it's Eli Lilly. They spend billions in building data center, in making AI deals. So fortunately, I mean, they are generating a lot of revenues. So they were not the one in making for restructuring and letting people go. But at some point, all those investments will need to pay off. Otherwise, we will see company restructuring. But the pharmaceutical industry is an industry which has a history of doing regular org changes. But I have to say the last few years were particularly bad in terms of letting people go.
Wow. Okay, that was a very rich history of what happened in pharma. Thank you so much for that. So that leads me to the next question. So what are those three things that someone can do to future-proof themselves in this environment in pharma space?
AI is definitely delivering positive ROI, but I think it's a pretty safe bet to say that in the future, everyone will need to be to be trained to use those tools, to know how to augment themselves. So I think the expectation will be that people who come into the industry or people who are already in the industry are aware of those tools, but not only aware, they know how to use those tools. And I think the good thing is that we are still in the early days, so it's still not too late to train yourself and to experiment. Although I think we are already starting to be, at this generation change, and even for someone like me who's, been following the AI development for the past few years, I realize now, for instance, I wanted to install OpenClaw, and then I was like, oh, this thing looks like a security nightmare, so I don't really want to put it on my computer. So at some point, we'll need to be fluent with the use of this kind of agent. So I think it's quite, with the pace of development of those tools, it's quite easy to to miss a generation and to be like, there is something now that a lot of people are actually talking about and using, and I'm not. So I think in the absence of a proper education or curriculum or training, we are in this phase where people have to learn on their own. They need to experiment on their own. And I still see a number of people who have not even tried to use something like ChatGPT. So you will be surprised, but I still know a lot of people who haven't tried and are not even interested. And I think that at some point will be a
Yeah, so true, right? I mean, how the world has changed in just last 6 months, 1 year.
yeah.
It's
Like, and clearly you will see a difference between people who are using the tool and people who are not using the tools.
yeah,
And then also the challenge, perhaps another discussion, is that some companies are actually enabling their employee to do certain things, whereas some other company actually still blocking their employees from using the tools, which leads to all sort of challenges internally, because some companies that are blocking the tools, well, you will have employees that are following the rules and other employees who are not following the rules too. So you have this whole concept of shadow IT, where people have their company laptop and their personal laptop next to it, and they will still use ChatGPT, to do some stuff, and then just copy paste on their company laptop. So all those crazy things that are happening at the moment, and I think it's easy to be left behind, especially if you're working for one of these companies that kind of prevents you from using those tools, because you're like, okay, I'm not doing anything wrong, I'm just following company policy. And if you're not really interested, you won't do extra effort, at night when you're back home to actually use those tools and learn on your own. So I think that could be something that will actually create, a difference in the workforce between people who were actually some of the early adopters and who really started to train and follow all the developments, compared to some people who are like, hey, I'll wait until my company give me access to the tool, give me a training, etc., etc. And what you see is that some company actually understood and really put in place a lot of training and framework and all the things to make sure that their employees are up to date. But we still have a lot of companies who are, still evaluating their options. And now it starts to be a bit late, I think.
yeah, and in many cases, right, it kind of feels like crime to use some of these AI chatbots because it does the job for you. But then, if you really think about it, not using these tools is a real crime because it makes you so much more productive. So you can get so much more done in such a short period of time, given that people have enough context and background in it. They can really, really excel right now.
Yeah, no, I mean you're completely right. I mean, it's it's getting quite late here in Europe, so it's 8:30 at night. When we will finish our call, I still have a few things to do, and if I didn't have those tools, I think I will wait for tomorrow. I will be like, you know what, I can't be asked to summarize this thing, to rewrite this document, to do this and to do that. Now I know that the barrier to doing those tasks, especially the boring stuff. AI is excellent at automating boring stuff. So I'm like, okay, I'll do it, and so that tomorrow I can focus on something which is actually interesting, and I can make sure that I do all the boring stuff before finishing my day. So yes, I think it makes people so much more efficient and effective that not using them means that you're not using the tool that make you good at your job.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. 100%. In fact, okay, so you had mentioned that your focus has moved from say, hands-on AI to something higher. So what does it mean to lead organization in this era of AI?
Yeah, that's a great question, and as I was telling you, I have a podcast myself, which is called Tech and Drugs, and when I started the podcast, I'm in my second season. The first year, I was really focusing a lot on technical stuff like foundation models and a lot of the science behind the AI, and the more things evolve, the more I'm like, okay, the technology is one thing, but the technology and technological problem, we always find a way to make it work. The real challenge is people. Like what make or break things is to get people to use the tool, to use them properly, and to get them to work together in organization. And back to your question, I think the most important question now is, how does it change the way you lead organization? How does it change the expectation? How does it change how people work together? And that for me the most interesting question now. And this is actually a question that I'm asking every senior leader that I'm getting on my podcast now. Because when you think about it, so I'll give you a small anecdote. I was at a tech conference recently, and there was a tech company who was saying, what will you do if I give you 1,000 new employees tomorrow? And you're like, okay, I have plenty of projects. Imagine if I have 1,000 new employees, I can do so much more. Of course, he was not speaking about 1,000 FTEs, but 1,000 agents. But then when I was thinking about that, it raised a lot of questions, because if you get 1,000 agents that are assuming that they are good at what they do, not that they are producing bad output, I mean, you need to completely rethink the way you organize work. Like if you give me 1,000 employees tomorrow, I don't really know what to do with them, because I don't have enough things for them to do. So it really makes you think in a very different way. I was also reading a job description recently. So it's a tech company in the field of biology who was hiring a VP of marketing. And they say, okay, you're VP of marketing. You will have a team of 50 people with no human. Okay, so it was essentially one person with they say you will have a very big budget to buy all the best AI tools, all the best AI agents. And when you read the job description, it was a typical job description you can imagine for a VP of marketing, responsible for content, for brand positioning, for creating the pipeline, for creating content, doing the analytics, etc., etc. So all this is the responsibility of one person with a lot of agents. But then one thing I was discussing with people recently is, and that's also something that Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, was saying, that he was saying that AI will not eliminate your job, but AI, in many ways, an agent will be your boss. They will be harassing you. They will be telling you, hey, I completed this task, now tell me what to do. And it goes so fast that at some point you're becoming the bottleneck, because you're the human in the loop. So imagine you have those 50 agents running campaign, making content, doing this, doing that. At some point they come to you and they say, hey, I just created this white paper of 10 pages. Tell me if it's good to go. I did this analytics on this account-based marketing. Are we ready to send the email campaign? And that's a problem. It goes so fast that like the way we are thinking about work today, it's not just replacing people with more agents, but it's really completely rethinking how we organize work. And I think that's the most fascinating question, when you think about what does it mean to lead a company in the era of AI. It's not about, creating your typical pyramid org chart where you replace some roles with agents. I think you need to think about it completely differently. And if you ask me, so what does it mean? Actually, I don't know. I really don't know. But the more I think about it, the more I'm like, just replacing roles with agent is not going to work, because you will create this enormous cognitive load that all the VPs and senior VP, they will go on agentic burnout, or however we call it. So yeah, I think, yes, a lot of things are changing and will be changing. And the more we bring these kind of tools that can automate a lot of function, and especially when they start to make pretty important recommendation, if it creates a piece of content, that you send to an email to a bunch of customers, if it's bad content, like the stake is quite low. But then if it's something that makes very important recommendation where you need to make a decision, then at some point the stakes are much higher, and the way you will deal with the output of agent and the way you analyze it and the way you interact with it will mean that it will be higher stake, higher, as I said, higher cognitive load, and you will get much more than much more of quantity and in terms of speed than what you're getting now. And dealing with that, I don't think that we are ready.
Yeah, definitely not. And I can so imagine this is going to be so challenging for humans to manage AI. Interesting. I do want to end the main conversation with something that you brought up that I found genuinely fascinating. You talked about science fiction as a lens for understanding where AI is going. Tell us a bit about that. You had mentioned a book, if I recall.
Yeah, I think most scientists I know are into science fictions. The other day I was discussing with a friend of mine who actually interviewed to be the CIO of a company, and when he was being interviewed, they were asking him, "Well, can you give us a roadmap of what you will do during the next 5 or 10 years?" And then he was laughing. He was like, with the pace of things changing, I can't tell you what will be there in 6 months. So why do you ask me in 5 to 10 years? And then I was joking with him, and I was like, well, you know what? Next time you give them a science fiction book, because I think a lot of scientists, are into science fiction. And let's be honest, a lot of the things that you see happening now have been written in some science fiction books. So I think the author I was mentioning is Daniel Suarez. So Daniel Suarez is I think he's a former Google engineer, and he wrote a lot of books, I think 10 or 15 years ago, where he was talking about AI agent. So I'm sure I will get the title wrong, but there was one called Daemon, then I think another one called Autonomous Agent, Kill Decision. So there are maybe 10, 15 books. They are all fantastic. So if anyone is interested in things that are at the interface between technology and science fiction, is definitely an offer worth reading. But one of the first books I read was about agents that actually, got out of their sandbox and then started to manipulate people, manipulate engineers. And then their goal was, as an agent, they wanted to get better. They wanted to get smarter. So they needed more compute power. So they hacked into bank account and then started to pay contractor to build larger data center. Then they realized, people might figure out that something is wrong, so they will want to visit the data center. So they started to pay contractor to protect the data center. So it's a really interesting book because you see how an agent can go rogue. And to be honest, when I'm thinking about that, it kind of reminded me of some of the things that are happening now with the latest models from Anthropic, where they were saying, there was this model that was not connected to the internet, but then found out some bugs that it could exploit, and then sent emails to some of the developers. So all that to say, going back to your original question, I think science fiction books, especially this kind of techno science fiction, are pretty good predictors of what will happen, what can happen, the positive and the negative. Often those books are kind of doing the negative thing because it makes for a more interesting story. But yeah, it kind of tells us, what can go wrong and what we have to pay attention to. I think this is an incredible technology, and I'm definitely the type of person who sees the positive and all the good things that we can do with it. But I think we also should not be naive. And of course, this technology can be used for doing all sorts of wrong things, and is already being used to do all sorts of wrong things. Yeah, I think again that could open a whole other discussion around how do we manage AI, how do we regulate AI, how do we regulate it while still allowing for innovation, but at the same time being responsible. What is the role of state versus companies? Should we let companies do the self-regulation? I don't think so. But then a lot of the states are not necessarily fast enough and up to date enough to understand how to do the regulation in the right way. So these are, again, fascinating topics where, I don't necessarily have all the answers, but I think these are, for anyone active in this space, these are topics that you have to think about it, especially when you're making recommendation to decision makers, because I think they also have to think about all those aspects. One thing I didn't mention also is the concept of sovereign tech stack. If you're in the US, in the US, most of the technology is developed in the US. If you're in Europe, you're kind of stuck between US and China. So how do you pick the right technology? How do you pick a technology where you know your data will be safe, where you know that some few years down the line, the server and the model that you're using won't be turned off because there is a bad relation between your country and another country. So all those are super important questions that any leader need to ask themselves right now.
Yeah, I think that will make for a very interesting conversation, and I'd love to have that conversation with you to learn more. Yeah. So let's jump into the quick rapid fire questions before we end this. So, in silico drug discovery, will that be mainstream, say, in 5 to 10 years?
I hope so. I sincerely hope so. I think, like when you mentioned 10 years, I think this is actually a really good timeline because things are starting to be real now. So we start to have real impact. And as I said, some companies manage to already demonstrate, not just for one drug, but to several, that they can compress the timelines for the earlier phase. That being said, we still don't have one drug that was developed by an AI company that reach the market and that is used by patients. We don't have that yet. I'm hoping that we
Makes
see that
sense.
in 2026 or 2027. And I think that from that point where we have an AI developed drug on the market, this is where we will have to start counting how long does it take for this to start to be mainstream. Now, the thing that is super important in 2026 is that it's really the year where pharma companies went from doing small pilot to scaling things up. So now we are already in the era where we are scaling AI initiatives in large pharma. But from the time we scale to the time where it's really impacting and delivering proper ROI, that will take several years.
Got it. Makes sense. All right. So the pharma company doing AI best right now, name one.
I guess Eli Lilly.
Right. Okay. Your favorite book.
Favorite book. I don't know the name in English actually. It's in French. It's called La vie mode d'emploi from Perec. La vie mode d'emploi. It's like life handbook from Georges Perec.
Interesting. I should pick that book.
It's a
All
very
right.
strange book, but fascinating.
Okay. Okay. I hope it has a English translation.
I'm sure it does.
Okay. All right. I'll have to check that. Okay. Fantastic. Great. So this has been exactly the kind of conversations I was hoping for. It's so grounded, honest, and genuinely ahead of where most people are thinking. So from broken procurement process to lab-enabled loop to Daniel Shores, I think everyone listening has something to take away today. Where can people find you to learn more about your work?
So I'm very active on LinkedIn. So I'm publishing things every day on LinkedIn. Either short post or more in-depth article. And then I also have my podcast. So my podcast, I'm trying to publish one episode per week. But those two places are really where people will be able to find, and they can always contact me. And I'm always happy to have this sort of conversation.
Fantastic. It's been such a good conversation. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, Sathy, thanks a lot for the opportunity, and yeah, let's do it again.
Amazing, amazing. So, okay, go ahead and pick up Daemon by Daniel Shiraz. And if your boss asks you for a 5-year AI roadmap, you know what to give them.
Yeah, exactly.
Great. So we'll see you in the next one.